My name is John Helveson. I'm an assistant professor at George Washington University, and I'm going to talk today about the resale market for electric vehicles. The resale market is really important. About 70% of sales every year are used vehicle sales. And the used market is much more affordable than the new car market. Now, post-COVID, these prices have increased quite a lot, so even used cars are still pretty expensive today. But for many people, this is the only option they have. So it's really important that we look at it and we look at how electric cars are faring in this market. We really need to understand these resale value. How are EVs depreciating over time? It's a really important component in a lot of different other aspects of research around EVs. So any total cost of ownership model, like the one I have linked here from Argonne National Lab, these studies look at depreciation as a key input to their estimates of cost of owning an EV. Resale anxiety has also been noted as a potential obstacle to EV adoption. So this is people who are unsure of how well this car is going to perform in terms of holding its value. And so we may not choose to buy one. And we're actually seeing a much higher lease rate in EVs than purchasing. So way more people are leasing their car precisely for this reason. They're worried about depreciation. So they don't want to make that new car purchase. And instead, they're either going to buy used or lease it. There's been a lot of prior work that have actually looked at this. A lot of that work is from much earlier times. So we're looking at model years from 2011 to 2015. So sort of the first generation of EVs. Or if it's been more recent, it's a little bit outdated. I'm sorry, not outdated, but smaller sample sizes. So those are kind of the two issues in prior work. It's either sort of somewhat outdated or it's been relatively smaller sample sizes. In this study, we use over 9 million vehicle listings from vehicles listed online. So this is the data source for this study. It's from 60,000 or so dealerships from 2016 to 2020. And you can see in this table the numbers of car listings we have. Most of those are conventional vehicles. But we do have quite a lot of EVs, and we separate out battery electric cars into Teslas and non-Teslas, so any other BEV, because Tesla is a kind of a different category here as an electric car. They're kind of an outlier. We also have plug-in hybrids and hybrids. So this is the data set we're using, and what we're doing is looking at the listing prices that dealers were asking for a lot of different cars over this time period. The data actually goes out to 2022, but we decided to cut it off here because of the pandemic. After the pandemic, prices kind of went wild. There were times where used cars were selling for more than the new car, so we decided to just stop it here when we had some somewhat normal market behavior. I'll mention briefly that this data set was also used in another study where we looked at mileage. So if you want to look at either of these two studies, this is the one I'm presenting today on resale value. It was published in Environmental Research Letters, but we also had another one on EV mileage where we saw we were looking at the odometer readings on these listings, and we saw people were driving a lot less. EV drivers were driving a lot less than gas car owners. So just putting this up here, it's from the same data source. So this is what we're looking at in this study. Very simple metric, just what's the retention rate? So we take the listing price and we divide it by the MSRP for when that car was new. So this is going to give us a metric from 0 to 1 of how much of that original value is now retained, or the retention rate from when it was listed. And just plotting that, you can already see some pretty obvious pictures here, some pretty obvious trends. So the way you can look at this chart is this is the age of the vehicle on the x-axis. The y is that 0 to 1 retention rate. So as you would expect, over time, vehicles lose value. The gray bars here in the back, the gray lines are the same. So this is conventional gas cars. And I've put that in every chart just to have a standard thing to compare against. So hybrids depreciate almost identically to conventional cars. Plug-in hybrids, they depreciate a little bit quicker. And then we see a big difference in battery electrics between the non-Teslas and the Teslas here in blue. Teslas actually hold their value quite well, and over time sort of converge with conventional cars, whereas non-Teslas have not done so. They've depreciated a lot more quickly. Okay, so that's the raw data. That's just plotting it. And by the way, this middle line is the 50th percentile. So this is sort of the median retention rate, and the bands cover the middle 50%. So you're looking at the middle 50% of all the data we have. So we model this using an exponential decay model. It's pretty straightforward. Where this is an exponentially declining phenomenon. This retention rate metric. And so if you just take the log of this, you end up with something that you can estimate with basic linear regression. So not a lot of complexity here. It's just linear regression, but using this transformation so that we can look at exponential decline in value. This is the sort of average result you get if you look at the model we ran for all of the data we have. This matches those summary pictures I just showed you. You see conventional and BEV Tesla, conventional and hybrid here are right on top of each other, the blue and red. We see a big difference between BEV Tesla and BEV non-Tesla, the purple down here. So BEV Tesla is actually doing quite well early on, and then, like I said, kind of converges with conventional cars. Of course, that's just like a high-level average, so not super interesting. We decided to dig into a little more detail with the data that we had. And one thing we looked at was the model year. So we estimated a model where we had control for every model year. This is the vehicle model year. And we made a prediction of what would the value of that car be in 2 years. So on average, most conventional cars, they lose about 20% of their value after 2 years. So they're down to 80%. And that's pretty flat. Same for hybrids. You don't really see a huge trend, a little bit of a dip, but not too much over the model years that we have in this data set from 2012 to 2018. But we see a big change over in the electric cars. So plug-in hybrids and non-Tesla BEVs have actually gained value quite a lot. They were down to 40% in model year 2012s, but most recent, 2018s, they're getting very close to where we're at with conventional cars. So we're starting to see sort of convergence here of these cars holding their value about as good as a conventional car. Now, Teslas are actually sort of strange here. They've historically done very well in holding their value. But what you see over time is the newer ones are starting to fall, actually. They're holding their value close to non-Teslas. And there's a lot of different things that are affecting this. Part of this is Tesla was cutting its new car prices over this time period. So when you cut the price for your MSRP, that's going to have a bigger hit in your used car market. It's going to depreciate those cars faster. So that was one thing. And by the way, this is the Model S in this data set. It's the only one we have all these model years for. Okay, so that's one average effect we saw was the story doesn't look good for EVs, but it's changing. It does seem to be improving over time. And if you look at every specific model in our data set, you see these big jumps here. Here, this is just the same plot as this, but broken down by the model. And you can see for plug-in hybrids here, we only have 4. We have quite a lot of BEVs. And from 2014 to 2018, you see this big bump in the predicted 2-year retention rate. Some of these don't have a 2014 because these cars didn't exist yet, right? So like the Chevy Bolt and the Model 3, they only came out in 2018. So we could see their retention rates here. But for the ones that did exist over this whole time period, like the Nissan Leaf, we saw very big increases. One of the things that really contributed to this, that's also sort of correlated with the model year, is range. We saw a big improvement. Higher range vehicles had much higher retention rates. And in fact, we saw this, again, at a model year sort of effect. So if you plot just the range of the vehicle against the retention rate, you can see the predicted 2-year value increases quite a lot. So like the Nissan Leaf, it's going from about 75 miles of range up to 150 in just 4 years. And we saw a really big bump in its ability to hold its value. And that was consistent across a bunch of different models that we had, over four different years to look at. Tesla, we see something of an opposite effect, although I think this is very specific to the things that Tesla was doing during this time. Like I said, cutting new car prices. So I don't necessarily think this trend here of downward with increased range is a feature of the range and much more a feature of something happening at Tesla specifically. So range matters, and newer cars that have higher ranges seem to be holding their value quite better. One other thing we looked at that I thought was kind of interesting was the effect or the potential effect of subsidies in the new car market on used car prices. So we think that cars that have a new subsidy in the new market should affect the pricing of the used market. And the logic kind of goes like this. If you've got a car, let's say the MSRP is $30,000, and you can get a $7,500 subsidy, then you're really only paying this much, right? $22,500. So that means the same car in the used market, if it's the same make and model and otherwise looks the same, but maybe it's a year or two old, that's the maximum value I would pay, right? Why would I pay $1 more when I could go get the brand new car at the same price? So we expect that this subsidy is going to be having a huge impact on used car prices, and it's going to have a suppressive effect on basically the immediate drop of the vehicle. As soon as it's sold, it's going to be dropped by at least this much in value. And we do see this. And so when we put this into our model, we see an effect of the subsidy itself. So cars that were listed used for the same make model that had a new car subsidy available in the new market, we saw a 3% pass through, meaning prices in the used market were lower by 3% lower than cars that did not have an equivalent vehicle in the new market subsidized. So we kind of tallied all that up and plotted it over time in the time period we were looking at. And we get about $255 million worth of lower prices, sort of price reductions in the used market that we attribute to the same cars being listed, having a new car subsidy. So this is sort of an indirect subsidy to the resale market. When you subsidize a new car market, you're going to get a little bit of pass through. Some of that subsidy money is going to impact the used car market and lower prices there. So that's sort of like free subsidies in a way. Like the government didn't have to pay anything extra, but they resulted in lower prices for used car buyers, which is, at least from the perspective of a used buyer, that's a good thing. Now, from the perspective of the new car buyer, this is maybe not so good because it means you're losing value quickly. Your car is going to depreciate perhaps even faster than it otherwise would have because it had a new car subsidy. And the last thing I want to talk about here was just looking at the impact of COVID. So this is a pretty simple summary chart where we just looked at the median prices, the mean prices for Teslas, non-Teslas, and conventional cars. And you can see that they're up quite a lot, over 30% since post-COVID. So this was as of 2022. Prices have gone up even more from that time till now. So there's really an issue of affordability now that's sort of hitting the whole car market, but this doesn't really help the EV market in particular. The used car market used to be this place where car buyers could go find a very cheap EV, and that's not necessarily so true anymore. So there's an issue here of affordability, and I think that's something we should keep talking about. So summarizing here, key takeaways: BEVs, they have depreciated faster than gas cars. We've seen that before. We're still seeing it in our data, but this is changing. Cars that have higher ranges and that are newer model years, they are holding their value better compared to conventional cars. And again, this is all pre-COVID, so some of this might have changed since, but we don't have any data since 2020 that we can really look at. We do see something of a pass-through effect of the new car subsidies. So when you have a new subsidy for new cars, that's going to result in a small decrease in prices in the used market. And then, I'm sorry, 40%. I said 30 on the previous slide. Post-COVID, pandemic prices are up 40%. So really high prices now that we're facing in the used car market. Thanks. So if you want to see these slides yourself, you can go to this website or slides.jhelvey.com. And then this is the link to this talk. And I have some extra slides too. So happy to answer your questions, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation, and I think he's online. So I'll ask you to unmute and answer any questions that came up from
Just joined. Sorry, I'm late from a previous meeting. My student was defending her PhD, so I had to run here. Hence why I pre-recorded that. So I see one question already that was sent to me on, does the depreciation model work across various classes like trucks and buses? So it would, but we don't have data on those. So that's one limitation. We only have vehicles from dealers, and at least in this time frame, there was like basically no pickup trucks that were electric yet. So mostly cars and a few SUVs. Any theories about why higher range cars hold their value? Are they sturdier? Or do they compete better? I mean, my biggest theory on this is really just sort of like this is sort of a phenomenon that happens in any technology that's rapidly changing. Like if you saw 4 years ago a car's range was half the range and the price was the same in the new market, then you might be a little concerned. Like, well, in 4 years from now, is this thing going to hold its value? I mean, it's changing so quickly. Maybe I should wait and get the latest one. So I think there was a period of time where we were just seeing rapid change on all sorts of things, and range is like the biggest indicator of improvement in the technology. So, but I think we're also hitting a limit with that. Like I don't like. I think people who are buying these cars now are realizing that they have more than enough range, and car makers are going to be more concerned about lowering prices than continuing to go to like 500 or 600 miles of range. I think car makers making 200 to 300 mile range cars that are cheaper are probably going to be like where you start seeing automakers go. Does this model also support or include various chemistries? Well, yeah, I mean it's any vehicle that's like been on the market in that time frame. It was a combination of um, NMC and LFP based on the different vehicles that were available. Although the whole industry seems to be going back to LFP now, like pretty strongly. So I think that that's what we're going to see for a little while going forward.
I'll ask a question while other people type questions in the chat. How would the above MSRP price on these new trucks, for example, affect supply in used car markets?
Above MSRP? Say that again. I didn't know what you mean.
Above MSRP. So a Ford
Oh,
F-150 Lightning
yeah,
and the like are having above MSRP prices right now.
yeah. I mean that's just reflecting demand, right? I mean, if there's an MSRP from the company and you're saying I'm willing to pay above it, and they're still selling, that just means there's big demand and the market is being undersupplied, right? So that's a good thing, at least from the perspective of like the future of EVs. That just indicated that there's big demand for these things. Um, and I think it's also showing in the used market that, as we're seeing used cars hold their value more, that value is being held because there's people who are willing to pay for it. They're willing to buy them. So plummeting off a cliff and seeing rapid depreciation is sort of a bad sign. It means people don't want this thing, or dealers are having trouble getting rid of it. They're having to cut prices. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. This is kind of what we wrote about in the paper, was like, this is great news for EVs that they're holding their value well, because it means people want them. It's a terrible thing from like an equity perspective, though, because it means that the era of affordable EVs may be gone. Like affordable, cheap used EVs are maybe no longer around. I mean, even in the used market, you're still going to see high prices. So we're still going to see probably adoption happening in a very unequitable way, where like the wealthier people are buying them, middle to high income households are going to buy them much more than others. Um, and the indications that range maybe indicate better reliability. I think that's also so another aspect of range here is just sort of um, in all the work I've done on consumer preferences, like outside of this, the preference for range is very nonlinear. Like if you're below 100 miles of range, it's a very concerning problem because you're getting closer and closer to zero, and that's very scary. But if you're above like 200, it slopes off. Like an additional 100 miles is less relevant to me at that stage. So if you're buying a car that has 200 to 300 miles of range, 4 or 5 years from now, if it's down to 150 because of the battery's getting degraded, I'm still less concerned. If you're starting at 100 new, then I'm going to get really concerned that 5 years from now I might only have like 50, and now we're really talking about serious limitations. So I think that's just part of it. It's just like buying a car that has enough of a buffer that as the car gets used and the battery degrades, it's still going to be a usable car in the future. I think that's like another big thing that we're seeing, that the response to range is probably nonlinear and matters much more at lower ranges than it does at high ranges. Any chance that regional changes, and we did look at this, for sure you would expect like cold climate areas would have maybe less demand for an EV or poorer performance, although we didn't really find anything. It might have just been a limitation in the data that so much of the cars are in California. I mean, right now, like if you just look at where the distribution of cars are, it's mostly in better climate areas. That's where they're being listed. So some of that might just be bias, and we don't see a lot in outside of like maybe Massachusetts, in the colder climate areas. Of course, an updated version of this where we're getting listings from 2024, we'll probably be able to answer that question better, because we're going to start seeing a lot more numbers now. Even in this time frame we were looking at pre-2020, the numbers are still, you're talking tens of thousands of cars, but that's not like millions of cars. So I think going forward, I'm going to try to continue to replicate this and hopefully get better answers to questions like, regional outcomes.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. If anybody wants to unmute themselves or put in the chat. Just a reminder, we have 4 more presenters today.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We'll give it up
Thanks.
to Denisa next.
Can everyone see the slide well?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, great. Give me a second. Hello, everyone. My name is Denisa. I'm a PhD candidate from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And today I would like to talk about my research work on vulnerability assessment of electric vehicles and their charging station networks during evacuations. This work is a collaboration with my advisor, Professor Alistair Contu, also from University of Illinois. So electric vehicles contributes to transportation system decarbonizations, but these vehicles still remain subject to technological barrier, such as range anxiety, charging station dependency, and also long charging time. According to DOE 2024 data, EV median driving range has improved significantly to 270 miles. However, it's still lower than gasoline vehicles. And we also know that a lot of federal and state governments have put huge investment in densifying charging stations to tackle this range anxiety issue. However, charging stations often populated in city centers and few are them located in interstate or outskirts, where oftentimes evacuation movement goes to that directions. So we believe that while these conditions are manageable to support daily mobility, this barrier can get more pronounced during emergency conditions. There is a study of Hurricane Irma evacuation movements shows that Miami residents movement can exceed more than 300 miles, exceeding the current median range of EV. So this indicates that during long-range evacuations, EV drivers subject to more frequent stops than gasoline vehicles to charge. Additionally, we need to also aware that due to the hazard type and also the intensity of the hazard, charging stations might also subject to severe power outages. So this condition makes the evacuations problem for electric vehicles become more complex. So we believe that the constraints like limited driving range and charging dependency need to be integrated in evacuation planning. However, the current literature's talking about the evacuation plan and also vulnerability assessment of electric vehicles evacuation is still lacking. That's why in this study, we aim to answer a critical questions to understand how vulnerable the electric vehicles drivers and the charging stations networks during real evacuation case. So our goal here is to assess the current vulnerability of EV drivers and their charging station networks during evacuations. And to do that, we develop a novel multi-criteria vulnerability assessments frameworks to assess the electric vehicles evacuations. So the approach consists of 3 phases. The first one is data collections. We want to understand what is the hazard intensity, the hazard footprints, transportation networks, charging station distributions, and also evacuation demand to our study regions. And then after that, we will kind of like construct the evacuations networks, and we run the evacuation scenario simulations considering the normal conditions where there is no hazard impacted. And we also run it under disrupted conditions like power outages and road blockage due to the hazard. And then we will kind of like measure from those 2 performance, how those the performance of the evacuations changes and define the vulnerability. We implemented into 2 cases, short notice flooding evacuation in Chicago. This is in the city scale levels. And then the next one is preemptive hurricane evacuation in Southeast Florida. This is kind of like the size of the network is kind of like 3 counties from Miami-Dade to the Palm Beach, Florida. So here's just kind of like a brief summary about the modelings that we kind of like create. to run the evacuation simulation and the hazard simulations. First, we have kind of like the scenario sampling scheme. We define a base scenario that's going to be become our baseline performance, and then we generate 15 representative scenarios considering power outages and road closure and also hazard intensity in the networks levels. And then given the scenario, we run the evacuation simulations. In these simulations, we consider 3 types of vehicles. We also simulate gasoline, EV with short range, about 150 miles, and also EV with large range, about 250 miles to represent the Tesla models. Again, as I mentioned before, we're gonna implement in 2 regions with 2 different types of hazard. So we kind of like model 2 types of evacuation routings that usually representative the flooding and also hurricanes. For the flooding, we model it as a short notice evacuation route plan. We model it as a system optimum traffic assignments with range between us constraint to model the charging needs and also the driving range. And then for the hurricane, we model it as a the preemptive evacuation, we model it as a evacuation tree route plan. This model is we already developed it in the previous study, and we added the range between us constraint to model also the range and charging needs. And then lastly is the vulnerability assessment models. So the vulnerability assessment of EV evacuations, here we define 6 criteria. However, in the future, we can always edit new criteria that we want to see, or also kind of like create a composite criteria on it. However, in this study, we're gonna focus on 6 criteria that we think is very critical to measure the impact of hazard to the EV drivers and also charging station networks. In evacuation literatures, system level performance often being used to determine the risk. Therefore, in here, we measure the change in travel time and also change in charging time and queuing time. And the second is to measure the mobility of EV drivers. We choose 2 criteria, the number of EV drivers that requires to charge to complete their evacuations, and also total number of them being stranded or isolated due to disconnected network or insufficiency to charge during the evacuations. And then lastly, here we measure the charging accessibility using the between centrality metrics. Then we present these 6 criteria into a radial diagram and normalize it from the value -1 to 1. Here is the evacuation networks data that we collected. I'm just gonna go brief on it. And then, so the transportation road networks, we collect it from OpenStreetMaps using OSNX in Python. And then we simplify the networks and simplify the nodes and also the lane. For the vehicles distributions, here for the Chicago, we collected from the vehicles registration in Illinois Secretary of State website and also Atlas EV Hubs. And for the Florida, we also use the Atlas EV Hubs for the state registrations EV data. Again, we consider 3 types of vehicles: gasoline, EV with short range, and EV with large range. And due to the limited data, we not having enough percentage about how many Tesla models that Chicago have and also in Florida. So we set up kind of like percentage. We set 40% of the total EV that we collected in Chicago to be EV with long range, and 60% of it in Florida to be EV with long range. And then the next is the charging station networks. We collected from the alternative fuel data centers, and we collected 3 types of stations, public level 2, public DC fast charging, and also Tesla Supercharge. We filters to only consider public charging stations that operate 24/7 and also without having parking permit, no front desk request, and not operated inside dealership or kind of like buildings. And then for the charging stations, we kind of like aggregate the station availability into the adjacent nodes in our networks. And this is kind of like the final networks that we're gonna use to simulate the evacuations in Chicago and in South Florida. The next important data is about the hazard. In here, we collect the flooding hazard from FEMA flood maps, and we complement it with MRCC data they kind of like monitor the flash flood depth in a certain point in across Lake Michigan's regions. And then we kind of like create four scenario. The first scenario is the base scenario that we're gonna use as our baseline, where we simulate the evacuation without considering the hazard, but we consider 75% of the drivers start with full charge or full tank, and 25% of them start with half battery charge or half tank. And then we consider three hazard intensity: mild flooding, moderate floodings, and severe floodings. And we define the probability of power outages and also block roach for each scenario. So here's the hazard map and footprints for the Chicago floodings for mild, moderate, and severe. And for the hurricanes, Florida, we collect the inundation depth due to the hurricanes from NOAA's storm surge flooding maps. Again, we consider four scenario: base, mild, moderate, and severe. For the base, similar with Chicago, we're not considering any hazard, but we kind of like consider some of the drivers start with not full charge. And then for the mild hurricane, we consider it as a hurricane category 3, moderate hurricane category 4, and severe hurricane category 5. And here kind of like the hazard footprints for the South Florida hurricanes hazard maps. So that's about the data collections. And then we run the models to see the vulnerability. So here is the Chicago flooding vulnerability. In Chicago, we visualized our findings by 3x3 diagrams. If you see in this kind of like row directions, you can see that this is the impact of increased flooding intensity, mild, moderate, and severe. Then we also consider different levels of start battery charge in the column directions. If all of the evacuees start full charge, some of it half battery, and then some of it near empty. Some key observations that we found is that EV with short range, which is 150 miles, always require charging during evacuations. And I think this is kind of interesting because Chicago is actually quite small networks, but through our simulations, even with short range, it still requires to charge, and it's increasing their vulnerability. While most of EVs with long range, about 250 miles, does not need to charge. And then we found that during the severe flood, 80% of downtown charging stations are at risk. And then reducing the chargers accessibility by 76% and increasing the number of stranded drivers by 75%. And then as the impact of low state of charge in beginning of the evacuations, we found that drivers with low battery level face even greater challenges. The number of EV drivers requiring to charge increased by 30 to 50% across of the intensity of the hazard. And then we found that the isolated or stranded EV due to unable to find availability to charge increased by 2.5%. Here I also plot the energy demand profile for the Chicago evacuations under extreme cases, which is the low initial vehicle charge state. Here we can see and map which stations that is where they charge and who require which evacuee that required to charge and how much they need to charge. Some highlights that we found here that on average, the expected average energy demand in all charging stations is about 300 kilowatt hours in mild, and then 250 miles in moderates and 150 kilowatt hours in severe floodings. It's become decreasing because you can see that the gray zone area here is actually the high risk regions of power outages. So as the intensity increases, less likely they can find operated charging stations. And then charging stations close to shelters subject to maximum expected energy demand is about can be greater and can be goes to 2,600 kilowatt hours in miles, about 2,400 in moderate, and also 1,300 kilowatt hours in severe floodings. For the Chicago, we also explore the impact of cold weathers. Our findings, again, we emphasize 3 by 3. The row here shows the impact of the flooding intensity, and the column here shows the impact of the weather temperatures and their impact to the battery efficiency. So we consider 3 conditions: normal weather, moderate cold, and extreme cold. Some key observations that we found is that the extremely cold weather condition and battery efficiency would affect the range anxiety and the needs to charge during the evacuations. However, in our simulation here, we found that there is no significant vulnerability changes with the slight decrease from 100, which is between normal weather to moderate cold. However, when the EV battery efficiency dropped to 60% due to the extreme cold, the number of EV drivers requiring to charge can be increased by 16% in mild, 4% in moderate, and 5% in severe. The last one is we assess the vulnerability in South Florida EV evacuations. Again, we consider similar with the Chicago cases. But some findings that we found is that the evacuation feasibility and vulnerability are unique depending on the scale of the transportation networks and the hazard footprints. We found about 85% of coastal charging stations are at significant risk during extreme hurricanes, reducing their accessibility by 62% and increasing stranded drivers by 42%. And if the drivers, again, with low battery levels, we found they again face a greater challenges, require more detours, and also can increase the average evacuation time by 48% and queuing time by 14%. And through our analysis, we also able to identify some critical evacuation policy implications for this study. We found that the strategic deployments of supplementary charging stations is important, and they need to consider the footprint of hazard and distance to the shelters. And collaborations of emergency authorities and charging station providers is very critical to strengthen charging connectivity. Because I believe that maybe most of you already knows that most of the time, the charging stations decision is not considering the emergency conditions. They're often considering the habitual demand. So the emergency planners needs to kind of like build the collaborations and communications, how we can kind of like provide the charging stations. Backup power supply plans, we believe that could also assist accommodating the charging demand. And one thing that we found is very important is the public vehicle preparedness guidelines are very important to improve the evacuation readiness. How does EV drivers in the future needs to prepare their battery charge states and also their own vehicles before they do the self-evacuations. So that's about the study. Some key findings, we found that most of EV drivers in the networks could evacuate safely in the moderate and mild hazard events with or without charging stations. However, in the extreme conditions, we found that some EV drivers, especially those that have a short battery range, rely on the charging stations accessibility to complete the evacuations. We also find that as the hazard intensity increases, EV drivers become more vulnerability, not only because of their ranges, but also because of the accessibility of the charging stations and also the number of them that being stranded because of the disconnected networks. The evacuation feasibility and vulnerability are unique, depend on the scale and property of the networks. We found that the initial state of charging determine the feasibility to initiate the evacuation, and it's really important to kind of like create guideline for that. And then the extremely cold weather conditions and battery efficiency also can affect the range anxiety and the needs of chargings. That's all about my presentations. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a question in the chat for you.
questions on power outages data. How was the power outages data? Was it real? So okay, so in here the outages was actually is not we define the power outages. This is not the actual outages data. So we define kind of like the regions that close to the sorry. So we define that a certain track here that close to the river lane or lake lane, and then we define that this area to be an area that have a higher probability to have outages and road blockage because it's close because they're at proximity to the hazard footprints, and then we define the probability of the power outages and the block roads. So it's not the actual. And then Chicago has a minimal wind factor. Why was chosen for the hurricane? No, Chicago is chosen for flooding scenario. We model it as a flooding, and then for the Florida, we model it for the hurricane scenario, hurricane floodings. Sorry, hurricane scenario. But the hurricanes will be, but we're not considering kind of like the impact of like the wind of the hurricanes or like the debris of the hurricanes. We see the impact more on the inundation depth. That's why we collect the storm surge flooding maps that corresponding to the hurricanes.
Thank you. I have a question, and it follows, I guess, similar to what Jean had said. You aligned the probability of blocked roads and power outages with where the risks historically have been. In the future, could you imagine that the power outage is in the middle of an evacuation route and people know this ahead of time, for example, that they need a detour and charge somewhere else? How might, I guess, EV evacuation behavior change with changes in detour time, both in distance, charging along that detour, etc.?
Yeah, thank you for pointing that. So right now, I think the limitation of the model is that everything is kind of like predetermined, and then we kind of like set up the routing from that. But we can understand that maybe in the futures, due to the autonomous and connected systems and also real-time warning systems, because the resilience field also kind of like they're also evolved with all of this autonomous and real times informations. So as I believe that I don't know how the behavior change, but I think uh, if we can kind of like have those informations real updated, then I believe that the EV drivers during the evacuations, they can always re-evaluate which is the safest and the fastest road. So of course, it's gonna change the road plan and also the traffics during the evacuations.
Are there other questions from the audience? I guess another question I had is EVs are a hot topic and resilience planning is also one. So where is the future of this work with EV risk and EV resilience and EV evacuation going? Where would you say the field is going right now?
Um, I think so for my from my perspective, I think there's a lot of like opportunity to do kind of like see how this EV evacuations. For example, right now, the study here focus on self evacuations. We know that there's also kind of like public kind of like communal evacuations, like for example, like FEMA have their own bus or vehicles, emergency vehicles, responders to kind of like also pick up the evacuee point, we can see that the adoption of EV might be also change their operationals. There's also kind of like is not only needs to be kind of like emergency conditions, even though we need to understand that even the daily uh I mean in daily in daily too, we also have kind of like extreme conditions, like maybe the power is kind of like limited. So the grid resilience in habitual condition and also emergency conditions might be also things that needs to be see on. And then I think my advisor in here, a lot of my other colleagues working on the opportunity of EV to be also kind of like become a power storage or backup power during the outages, then I think there's a lot of like things that going on in resilience. However, one things that I noticed when I talk with the resilience uh, folks, they they never really integrate or notice that EV adoptions needs to be implemented and needs to be addressed it in their application. So the introduction of this resilience and EV is also still new. So a lot of like future research to there.
And I just saw that your advisor had mentioned the evacuation behavior study. I had a follow-up question if that survey link is still available, can be
Yes.
put in the chat. And Kenneth just mentioned something in the chat for you about concluding whether charging stations should not be placed in the FEMA flood zone due to risk. So this is talking about general planning principles for EV charging stations. And do you know maybe that if NEVI, for example, has certain
Yeah.
placement restrictions based upon risk or localized risk?
Yes.
No, yeah. Okay. So there is
Yeah.
some foresight, thankfully.
Yeah, sure. I believe there's also a report from NREL and also like NEFI about the placements of the charging stations. However, still, I think I argue that the charging stations deployment right now is on the private levels, and they don't really care about the emergency. What they care is like profit maximizing. So we need to kind of like create maybe people in policy needs to kind of like create better strict regulations about that. Yes. Sure.
So thank you so much. I will hand it off to the next presenter.
Hello, everyone. This is Omid Armantalab. Today, I'm going to present my research on potential for electric vehicle adoption in Midwest US states, a stated preference, and two-stage MRP study. My co-authors, Rida Gosh and Dr. Hawkins. Personal vehicle electrification is cited as a primary pathway toward decarbonization in US. And switching from gasoline to electric vehicles has a greater impact for pickup trucks than sedans. That is, for pickup trucks is reducing 62 tons of CO2 equivalent to 40 tons for sedans. Our focus in this research is market share forecasting, considering vehicle size and the adoption of new statistical approach in transportation engineering, which is common in political polling. Our survey on we had a survey actually on electric vehicle attitudes and adoption in US Midwest, especially in Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Minnesota, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota states. We are presenting the first application of MRP in transportation uh, with two population extensions. Our method is actually common in political opinion polling. And we did see similarities between these two fields in terms of uh, both are normally focused on discrete outcomes. For example, in politics, we have choice between candidates, and in uh, transportation, we have choices from, for example, for mode, destination, or vehicles. And the second similarity is that both fields rely on national pools administered to individual or households. Uh, MRP begins from Bayesian model specification with hierarchical or partially pooled intercept parameters. MRP, so was our method, and the P in MRP stands for post stratification, which is a statistical technique to reweigh survey responses to better reflect the underlying population. And MR, multi-level regression, is analogous to the common mixed logic model, which we have in transportation analysis. We also added an additional stage, the second stage of MRP in our study, which is not used in other studies. So the second stage is actually correcting the bias, not only for human population demographics, but also for vehicle fleet distributions. As we can see in this figure, in the first stage, we try to predict current vehicle in different PUMAs by using experience vehicle registration data, IPF technique, and also psychoeconomic post-stratification table. So we produced the joint psychoeconomic vehicle table to use in the second stage. And in the second stage, we used stated choice experiments to predict the PUMA level fleet forecast. In our survey, each participants completed 6 different discrete choice experiments. In each of them, respondents were asked to choose between 6 vehicles: gasoline small car, electric small car, gasoline large car, electric large car, gasoline pickup truck, and electric pickup truck. So they had 6 choices, 6 options to choose, and they were faced with different attributes for different vehicles, and they had their choices. Uh, uh, to have some descriptive analysis of our survey, we can see that in this figure that we have 3 kind of vehicles: small car, large car, and pickup truck. And it can be shown that the respondents showed that pickup trucks owners are more likely to use their vehicles off-road public roads. And in this figure, we can see that jobs like agriculture, forestry, and other resource jobs are more likely to use their vehicles off-roads. And we can see the first part of our results, actually the model results in this picture. We see a box plot. This box plot is showing variation for different vehicle types: small gas, small electric, large gas, large electric, pickup truck gas, and pickup truck electric, we can see that pickup truck electric is showing the least variation between vehicles, and also pickup truck gas and large electric vehicles are showing the most variation among vehicles in all Pumas. And the second part of the results is showing the actually in this figure we are showing for each vehicle type, small, for example, small gas, small electric. For each vehicle type, we are showing 15 lowest and 15 highest uh, Pumas in terms of adoption of that vehicle, because we didn't have actually uh, space to show all Pumas, so we decided to only show the lowest and highest adoptions. So we can see, for example, for small vehicle, the gas small vehicle, we can see 15 uh, lowest adoptions, for example, in Missouri, Minnesota, and that number are showing the Pumas. And we have it for all type of vehicles. So we are kind of identifying regions with lowest and highest adoption levels for each vehicle type. And in our last part of the results, we showed the adoption of electric vehicles, all electric vehicles, in different regions in Midwest. So in this figure, we can see the different regions in uh, Midwest in terms of electric adoption. So yeah, that's the map for that. In addition to the main results, we also are presenting some supplementary results. Uh, the first is coefficient for fixed variables. So we can see in this table that small electric, large gas, large electric, pickup truck gas, and pickup truck electric, all of them are showing negative alternative specific constants. So compared to the base, which is small gas. And also for four variables: purchase price, purchase incentive, fuel cost, and recharging time, we can see the coefficients. All of them are negative except for purchase incentive, and we can see a larger coefficient for recharging time at stations for electric vehicles. And the second supplementary results is a kind of policy sensitivity analysis. In this figure, on the left-hand side of the figure, we see a chart showing, I mean, one is showing the MRP model with post-stratification using both demographics and vehicle type variables. So it is the results of our model, but aggregated for each state. So we are seeing the results only for states. In the second chart, we are seeing the same model, but we increased the incentive for pickup trucks by 20%. And in the third chart, we can see the same model, but we decreased the electric charging time at stations by 20%. But with this policy changes, we can see very slight increases in EV adoption. So to conclude this presentation, we first show that we predict vehicle fleet mix in US Midwest in 7 states broken by Pumas. We develop a two-stage MRP model, and the results show that we have the lowest variation among Pumas for pickup truck electrics and highest variation for pickup truck gas and large electric cars. Also, the primary results of this research showed that actually, in addition to primary results, we showed that the impact of four variables: purchase price, fuel cost, recharging time at stations, and purchase incentive on choices. And also, we showed that recharging time at stations shows the most significant influence on respondents' choices. We also showed policy sensitivity analysis that suggested differential incentives for pickup trucks would not have a significant impact on battery electric vehicles market share in US Midwest, and also showed that recharging time would also require significant reductions to affect overall electric vehicle adoption in Midwest region. Uh, uh, I want to acknowledge uh, Abigail and William during the study for conception and design, and also this research was funded by the University of Nebraska Lincoln. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your presentation on EV behaviors or EV adoption in the Midwest. We had a question from Kenneth about maglev systems versus EVs and why that hasn't been studied. Do you have some comments pertaining to that question?
Excuse me, let me just see the question.
Sure. Maybe you didn't consider it in your region because of the trip distances and the lengths between cities, and the relatively low population between those cities in the Midwest.
Yeah, that could be one reason. Yeah, because in Midwest we have kind of different situation than other part of the US, so it is just a particular for this region. But the method is applicable to other regions for different purposes. Also,
I think I had a question or a comment about your slides comparing the different states and likely adoption of different vehicle types. I saw that North Dakota seemed to dislike large vehicles regardless of the powertrain. So large gas, large BEV for North Dakota had relatively small shares compared to other states. Is that just a result of the sample size and who you selected by North Dakota, or is it pretty representative of the state as a whole? And maybe comment on why you had relatively low shares of large vehicles there.
yeah, kind of South Dakota and North Dakota was kind of different from what we expected before, but we kind of checked the model results and the process, so everything was okay. But this is kind of because of the sample that in our sample we had those uh, respondents choosing those options. So yeah, that's because of the sample.
And I guess another question I had was you had collected data about how frequently people drive off-road.
Yeah.
Was that statistically significant in your model, and how would that impact the next vehicle choice that Midwesterners have?
Yeah, actually, we didn't use this variable in this model because our purpose of this study was kind of showing only the application of this method and introducing the method, but we used this variable in the other research that we have under review and ICLV model, integrated choice and latent variables, and yet that was a significant variable there.
Okay. And one final comment, I know some UC Davis students have studied, I guess, California EV adoption in rural, urban, suburban areas. So I wonder if the rural California EV adopters have similar traits as those that are in the Midwest. So that could be a good thing to compare across states to identify whether rural Americans behave similarly on the East Coast or West Coast, as well as in the Midwest.
Yeah, thank you for comment. Yeah, actually, we had a lot of references in the second research, and we had those papers in California, and we compared kind of our results to those papers in the second paper. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? Please type it in. All right. Well, thank you so much. We'll hand it off to Hania for the next
Thank you so
presenter.
much.
Hi. Um, my name is Hania, and today I'm going to present my research paper on electric vehicle and supply equipment adoption dynamics in United States. This work has been completed under the supervision of Dr. Jason Hawkins. So this is going to be the sequence of my presentation. We'll be starting with introduction, giving you some graphs about the data set, explaining the nature of the data, and then we'll move towards research objectives, a method of analysis, results, conclusion, and the contribution of our work. So as we all know that countries across the globe are taking actions to fight the harmful effects of anthropogenic climate changes. Our focus for the climate scientists and the policymakers alike is to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions emitted into the atmosphere. The transportation sector accounts for almost 29% of the US greenhouse gas emissions that are mainly due to the fossil fuels. So vehicle electrification is considered as critical for the climate change mitigation. And we all know that the Biden administration has set certain goals for electric vehicles, like the new sales of 50% of the new sales of the vehicles to be electric by 2030, and 500,000 new chargers to be deployed across the country by 2030. US government is promoting electric vehicles, but the pace of adoption remains slow, and purchase price and lack of the charging infrastructures are considered as main barriers to EV adoption. Let's have a look at some of the targets that have been set by the Biden government. So the goal is to make the America electric, and the US is aiming for 50% of electric vehicle sales by 2030. And today, almost less than 1% of the country's 250 million vehicles are electric. And in November 2021, the Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which includes replacing the government's 650,000 vehicle motor pool with electric vehicles, electrifying almost 20% of the 500,000 US school buses, investing $7.5 billion to build out a network of 500,000 electric vehicle chargers across the country, and offering almost $6 billion in grant for battery processing and recycling. So let's talk a little bit about our data set. So the primary variables of concern that we have are the electric vehicle supply with equipment location data provided to us by the US Department of Energy, alternative fuel data center, and electric vehicle registrations data set that has been provided to us by Experian Inclusive. The electric vehicle registration data, it comprises of a 10-year panel data starting from 2012 and goes till 2020. And additionally, we have the data for the Q4 2021. And I also want to mention here that the total vehicle registrations data is recorded by county, make, model, year, and all the other characteristics of the vehicles. And our treatment and variables are electric vehicle supply equipment, which is the charging stations, and the plug-in electric vehicle registrations. And we have normalized it by population. The electric vehicle supply equipment data, it is geocoded and it has been aggregated into annual cumulative totals by the county. We have also used the American Community Survey data to incorporate some of the demographic variables like total population, median incomes, and we also access to the state-grade total carbon dioxide intensity. Um, yeah, so this is kind of like statistical summary of our data set. And you can see that we are going to use charging stations per capita. We have percentage minority, median household income, total county population, and the weighted network travel time. So this figure is really interesting. So here what we have done, we have plotted the total number of counties that has the zero plug-in electric vehicles in each year. And the objective of making this figure was to kind of see that how, the counties that had zero plug-in electric vehicles have been changing over the period of time. And you could clearly see a pattern, a declining pattern in the number of counties that had zero registrations for the plug-in electric vehicles, which means that the electric vehicle adoption has been enhancing over the period of time. And as we move forward from 2012 to 2021, we could see that the frequency of the counties having zero plug-in electric vehicles decreases. So this is another figure that basically plots the plug-in electric vehicles and charging stations normalized by population over the period of time. So this figure is quite important because it basically provides us with the validation of the research hypothesis that there does exist a relationship between the plug-in electric vehicles and the charging stations. So as we could see from the figure that there is an exponential increase for plug-in electric vehicles as well as the charging stations, which shows that there is correlation there is a correlation among these variables, but it does not give us any information about the temporal or the phasing causality. Moreover, we could also see that as the economy was hit quite hard by COVID in 2019, despite that, we are observing that the US plug-in electric vehicle industry has continued to grow, but there is still a long way to achieve 100% penetration across the country. So it's an interesting figure which basically plots the plug-in electric vehicle sales market share and the charging station per 1,000 inhabitants. So there does exist a positive correlation between these infrastructure, but you could see that Vermont has kind of like a higher rate of electric vehicle supply equipment per capita as compared to California. But it has not been able to achieve that much number of sales as the California has. So this comparison basically suggests us that it is not only the charging stations that let people adopt the electric vehicles. There are certain other factors that also play its role. So it might not be sufficient only to deploy the charging stations. Yeah, so after analyzing the data, we came up with the following research objectives. So first of all, we would like to check for the phasing or the causal relationship between electric vehicle supply equipment and the electric vehicles, and how does the covariates affect the EV adoption across USA at county level, and is it just a charging station access that encourages individuals to purchase the plug-in electric vehicles? And in order to test our test our research questions. As we all know that we are, as I described earlier, that we are dealing with the time series data set. So in order to check for the stationarity of the data, we will be using we use the augmented Dickey-Fuller test. And for the phasing causality, we use the Wilcoxon's rank test, in which we use various models in order to test for the causal relationship between plug-in electric vehicles and electric vehicle supply equipment. And then for the outcome-based, potentially outcome-based causality, we use the generalized propensity score matching. And at the end, to understand the effect of various covariates in our model, we use the GLM and the logit model. So I would start with, like, we applied the augmented Dickey-Fuller test and the KPSS test and across the time series, US time series, and also for its first difference. And it was revealed that the time series was non-stationary, and so the second part of the slide explains phasing causality phenomena, that phasing causality seeks to identify whether the two time series exhibit a common pattern or not, like one variable may lead the other, producing a time lag, or the time series may exhibit like instantaneous causality. We, as I explained earlier, and I'll be explaining in the next slides, that how we have employed this Wilcoxon's signed rank test, because it is used to check for the is used to test for the statistical significance, that whether electric vehicle supply equipment causes the plug-in electric vehicle. We have used a Python package to employ this test, and different models have been used, like RIMA, the GRU, the gated recurrent unit, LSTM, neural net, RIMA models. And here you can see that basically this table shows the results for the different models that we have tested with various lags. So basically the column that has been labeled as 1, 2, 3, and 4 has been are the results of these ARIMA, GRU, LSTM, MLP, and NN model results. The first column basically has used electric vehicle lags plug-in electric vehicle by 0 to 4, 6, 8, or 10 years, and similarly for others. And here the bold shows the significant effect size at the 5% level of significance, and the gray cells shows the larger effect sizes for the configuration. But these results doesn't suggest that whether it is the electric vehicle supply equipment that causes the plug-in electric vehicle adoption, or is it the plug-in electric vehicle adoption that leads to more deployment of the charging stations. So we also did this whole analysis for all the US, the 9 US census divisions, and in order to check that do we get like similar results or different results. But unfortunately, like, the results were same, and we have incorporated into our like full length paper, and you can access it online and see those results. And then, as previously I have mentioned, that we applied nonlinear Granger test to examine the phasing causality between PEV adoption and EVSE, and the results were suggesting kind of a feedback relationship. So, so then we used the generalized propensity score model that included the spatially lagged charging stations per 100,000 person in adjacent counties, the population identified as minority, and certain other variables. And we came up with this result, and this figure confirms the hypothesis that public electric vehicle supply equipment access encourages the individuals to purchase plug-in electric vehicles. However, the effect tends to diminish at higher electric vehicle penetration rates. In fact, we also get a negative relationship after reaching a certain saturation point, which means that after reaching a certain saturation point, enhancement in the electric vehicle supply equipment cannot lead to adoption of the plug-in electric vehicles. And we compare, like, these results were quite surprising for us. So in literature, we saw that similar kind of result has been received in many studies, like even in kind of like the medical literature, like there was a case in which they were showing that if you keep on giving like dose to a patient, it will help at a certain significant level, and after that giving an extra medicine could have the adverse effect on the patient. So yeah, so after that we have also used the GLM and the logic model, and we could see that from our results that there is a negative income parameter in the logic model, suggesting that as the income increases, the odds of a county having a public electric vehicle supply equipment decreases, which indicates that high income counties are less likely to have public charging stations as compared with the low income counties. And a positive relationship is exhibited for total county population, percentage minority, and the lagged plug-in electric vehicle per capita, suggesting that any of these variables will increase the odds of public electric vehicle supply equipment in a county. And the GLM model result shows that the lagged plug-in electric vehicle per capita and total county population are statistically significant. So also we applied kind of like the Box-Cox transformation onto our household income variable when we were getting a negative sign. So in order to test for the sign of our income parameter. So now I would like to conclude my discussion. So we have incorporated in our study, we have incorporated two types of causal relationships: the phasing causality and the outcome-based causality. And we have also considered the zero inflation phenomena into our research. And moreover, we have also discussed the role of electric vehicle supply equipment penetration rate over the period of time. And so the contribution of our study is kind of like we have extensively examined the co-evolving plug-in electric vehicle and electric vehicle supply equipment systems. Previously, the studies have been carried out, but we have expanded our analysis for including a longer time horizon, like starting from 2012 till 2021, and for all counties in the United States. We have combined two causal inference approaches to capture both the phasing and causal relationship between these markets. And furthermore, our work could be expanded in several directions. So while we find that electric vehicle supply equipment provide an initial boost, the policy mix to reach transportation decarbonization targets across US will vary by region. And PEV adoption is an evolving market, with each additional year of data providing new insights into the efficacy of policy and consumer behavior. So our work could be extended by incorporating the latest data, and if additional variables could also be incorporated into the model. Yeah, that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great presentation. We had a question from Kelly, if you could provide a link to the paper. I think it is also on ResearchGate. Is that not correct?
Yeah, it is
Okay, so
available.
you can work on providing the link shortly. Are there any other questions? Maybe Kelly had a follow-up question to dig into about this paper. I really found it interesting, the dose response for number of public charging stations per EV registration, and how that band grew as the number of people in a county or other spatial unit increased. Do you think that that's because of maybe the role of renting or multifamily housing that led to a potential increased need for public charging stations in certain locales versus in other locales where population's higher, but you don't need many public chargers?
Yeah, I definitely agree with your comment, and it's a really good constructive comment, and I will definitely like incorporate that into my discussion.
Mm.
we are kind of like expanding our work as well, like into incorporating the spatial diffusion thing into our analysis. Like it's another paper, but kind of like we were motivated by this fact that how over the period of time, the technology like electric vehicles, the hybrid electric vehicles, or the hydrogen vehicles have been kind of like diffusing into the neighboring counties, the ones that have the concentration of those technologies, and how the neighbors are adopting these technology, at what pace it is changing. And we were kind of like looking some really good results where we was seeing that the similar kind of states, we see similar patterns like for on the like California, and on the other side, if we compare it with like New York and those areas. So we were kind of getting some similar results, like the spatial diffusion was kind of the same in kind of the similar states, and the Midwest was kind like showing the adoption at a slower pace for these technologies, which made sense that people are adopting it, but it's kind of like at a slower pace as compared to the, I would say, the rich adopted areas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Something about the spatial diffusion models assumes that an EV adoption in one location is going to have a positive influence on other peers. Yet we know from also UC Davis researchers about people foregoing or letting go of their EVs. I think it may be 20% or so in one of their longitudinal data sets. I wonder if in our spatial diffusion models, if we're capturing both positive and negative diffusion aspects, and at what level that is shown in current research. So just a comment throwing out there that I wonder if our techniques are able to capture both positive and negative aspects.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we were kind of like, when I started this analysis, we were kind of like looking at Moroni coefficient of correlation, and we were kind of looking at the positive side of it, and not the negative, but it's a really good comment. I will definitely look into that. Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other comments maybe for the other presenters? We're a little ahead of time, ahead of schedule. We had a question about the percent minority in county. How is that defined? Was it a census or ACS definition that you relied on?
Yeah, so we were kind of using the ACS definition that was there.
Okay, and maybe a recent one. I'm sure the Census Bureau has shifted how they've defined minority over time. Okay, maybe the 2020 or 2010 census. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's queue up the next presentation. I think from Leah. Or Leah. We can't hear you yet.
Hi.
Now we can.
Although I
Great.
think Hanya did just get another question, or two, if you want to take those first.
Oh, yes. Here came in. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just posting the replies there.
Okay, well then I'll start sharing my screen. All right, all good?
Yep.
Okay, well, hello. In our last presentation of this session, we will be sharing how we found all, or at least most, of the school bus depots in the US and what we learned from that data set. I'm Leah Laser. I worked on this research as part of the Electric School Bus Initiative at the World Resources Institute. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Gregory Taff, who you will get to meet shortly. And also wanted to acknowledge our co-author, Yang Shao at Virginia Tech, who is the first author on this work, but could not join us today. So let's start off with some context. There are almost 500,000 school buses in the United States, but essentially no public information about where they are kept until now, until this data set, which filled a major data gap. So why is it important to know where school bus depots are located? The main use cases relate to health equity and environmental justice, and then also to electrification planning, which is why we're here in this EV session with you. So in terms of health equity, school buses, as you can see in this picture, are heavy duty vehicles. They mostly run on diesel, so they produce a significant amount of air pollution, which of course can cause health harms, especially for children. And we also know from the broader environmental justice literature that polluting and undesirable land uses like waste treatment facilities or truck depots tend to be located in marginalized communities, so areas with a larger proportion of low-income people or people of color. So I initiated this project with the theory that school bus depots are also disproportionately located in underserved communities. The other big piece of context is that we are at the start of the transition to electric school buses. Still early, only about 1%, but rapidly growing, and there's a huge amount of public funding available, I think, as Hanya alluded to in her presentation. So this data set could unlock the ability to incorporate health equity and environmental justice into decisions about which depots to prioritize for electrification in that context. Because in addition, the electrification of school buses will create hotspots of new demand for electricity to charge them. So knowing the locations of those depots will enable utilities and other stakeholders to more accurately model future electricity demand and then incorporate that into their planning for grid infrastructure upgrades. So for now, I'll pass it over to Gregory, who's our remote sensing expert, to explain how we created this data set, and then I'll come back to share some of the findings.
Great, hello. I don't know if I have control of the slide.
Yeah, I'll do the slides.
Great, thanks. Okay, so our main goal was to find the school bus depots in the U.S., as many as we could. And so we tried several methods first. Actually, it was before I joined this team, but there were several methods that really didn't work. The state education and transportation departments were contacted, but they didn't have data on depots. Calling all the school districts would be very difficult because there's 14,000, and getting detailed information from them, each in different formats, would be a challenge. We tried some web crawling, but we got inconsistent data and formats coming back, and I don't think we were confident that we were actually getting all the information about where many of these depots were. We looked at OpenStreetMaps, and they have some information there, but it's incomplete. We considered scraping Google Maps as well, but and the look showed us that a lot of the data was actually inaccurate, and there were a lot of missing points, and also it's against Google's terms of service to allow that and make that data public. So all these kind of first thought ways to find this were unsuccessful, so we decided to use remote sensing. So what we did, the issue with remote sensing, when you're looking at a national scale or a continental scale, the issue is that usually you need to look at least, like, depending on what the goal is, but 30-meter resolution plus data, which is like Landsat or the bigger data sets, because you're looking at such a vast area. And to look at very high resolution data is very difficult because there's just so much data out there. But we found a method we developed a method that was able to do this using very high resolution data, and I'll explain how that was possible. So we used NAIP imagery, which is from the National Agricultural Imagery Program in the US. It's a program that has repeat air photos of the whole US, only the 48 lower contiguous states, and not Hawaii and Alaska, but they're on a 3-year repeat cycle. And basically the whole US is photographed every 3 years at a resolution of between 0.6 and 1 meter pixels, so very high resolution data. There is red, green, and blue bands of the sensing. If you're not familiar with remote sensing, that's just how much red light is being reflected is given in one layer of information, how much green light is being reflected off of the Earth is in the second layer of information, blue, and then also near infrared, which we can't see, it's not visible, but it does tell us a lot about what the vegetation types are. So we used all that data, And we created a method with a 4-step process to find this, to find these depots. The idea first was to identify possible possible school buses. And we use an automatic image classification for that, which I'll go through each of these steps very quickly in slides. Then we verify the buses as using an object-oriented analysis. I'll explain what that is to kind of narrow down the number that are likely actually buses. Then we identify possible depots with a spatial clustering algorithm, and then we verify the depots using analysts to actually review each image, which was a big part of this. So the first step, we used spectral information only, which means only not looking at like spatial information. We looked at what colors were being reflected in these satellite imagery. And we're basically looking for the school bus yellow or the school bus white. As you can see on the image on the left there, school buses tend to be either yellow. They used to, I think, all be yellow, and then they realized that by putting a white top on the buses, it reflected more heat so that the kids in the bus wouldn't be too hot. So we looked for those colors around in these using Google Earth Engine. We did it through a classification, a remote sensing classification process. We used the random forest version of a classification algorithm, which basically tried to separate all of the imagery into a potential school bus, meaning white or yellow, other built up or bare ground area, or vegetation. This was done in Google Earth Engine because we're looking at such a massive amount of data with all these images across the US that this couldn't be done on a PC because it just needs such a massive amount of computer power. So that was the first step. The second step was to basically download this 3-class raster image to a PC. So what that means is we now have images that show every single pixel being either a possible school bus, other urban or built up areas, or vegetation. So this reduced the size of the imagery by a lot, because instead of 0 to 255, for instance, for each pixel, we only have three options for each pixel. So then we downloaded all the images state by state to a PC for further analysis. Then the first step here was to do an object-oriented approach to look at all the pixels that were adjacent to each other, contiguous pixels, to look for pixels that were in the shape of something quite similar to a school bus. And in this case, what we did here is basically, you can see in this image that is actually a depot on the right, and all those are buses. Some are a little bit covered by trees, as you can see, but they still are recognizable in those rectangular shapes and about the right size. The red areas on the left are actually roofs of buildings, and as you can see, they're really a different size. So we were able to get rid of all those, quote, false positives, because they're really not school buses. So we're starting to, we basically cast our net too wide, knowing on purpose, and now we're cutting out certain things. So the first step was through this spatial analysis. The next step, which is our step 3 of our process. Oh yeah, sorry. So we were able to delete those shapes, as you can see on the left there. But the third step is now we have a much more narrow definition of what's likely to be a bus. We still don't know for sure if they're buses, but we think they are. Most of them are. And we try to find clusters of buses, okay? So a bus depot, obviously, it usually doesn't have just one bus in it. We'll have more than one bus. Of course, there are some issues about the timing of the day and of the year, but we learned that most school bus depots, even when all the buses are out, still have up to 20% of their buses in the depot usually. So we're looking for areas with a whole bunch of buses, and we want them to not be like, 2 buses in a row on a street, for instance, right? Because that's not a depot. So we looked for at least 4 buses in a cluster. That was just kind of a decision we made to balance finding the depots and not finding too many false positives, like I said, in the street. And we used an 80 by 80 meter window to look for at least 4 of these objects that were detected in the previous phase. So now we've narrowed it down even farther by the shape and by making sure we have clusters of buses. So if you could go on to the next one, great. Then basically we're talking about, as I'll discuss in a bit, about 13,000 depots that we found. So it sounds like a lot, but in terms of time to look at 13,000 or maybe twice that in imagery, because we found a lot of false positives, was possible to do over some months with analysts. So we combined analyst analysis to actually look at all these potential depots. And in this very high resolution data, it's usually pretty easy for almost anyone with basic knowledge of what these depots may look like to figure out if it actually was or wasn't a depot. So this visual inspection step also included sometimes going to another air photo in ArcGIS World Imagery if they were uncertain, so we could check in two different places about at the same location. And as you can see here on the bottom left, all those in the yellow were positives that were true, and they're clearly school bus depots. On the right is something that came up that could look quite similar, but those that's actually a trailer home park, and they're not. It's not a bus depot, so the analyst could say, nope, this wasn't correct. Also note that if we found two clusters of buses within that were determined to be bus depots and they were within 500 meters of each other, we actually looked at it again and merged them, because often it's one depot that maybe straddles two sides of a street or two sides of a high school or something like that. Let's go on. So that was what our method, and then we did some accuracy assessment. We were able to compare our map output to a reference data set from two large school bus operators. The reference data set had 506 depot locations throughout the US, throughout 41 states, so it was quite a wide extent of area that we had this data for. So we look at commission and omission errors. So commission errors are basically when you include a site that is not a depot, but we would call it a depot. And we think we pretty much have 0 of those. And that's because all of them were inspected. So, we should, an individual should be able to see if we chose a depot that was incorrect. It's possible every now and then there may have been like a school bus repair shop that we thought was a depot, but we were pretty careful, and so we think we're around 0 there. The omission error, however, is the school bus depots that we missed. So our method successfully identified 429 of these 500 reference depots that we knew were there, about 85%, which means our overall omission error was 15%. However, we visually inspected the remaining, these 15%, the 77 depots in the imagery, and it turned out 39 of the depots were missed by our method, meaning that visual inspection saw 39 more that we didn't see. That means the remaining 77 minus 39, which is 38, we actually didn't see them in the imagery. So maybe even though they're in the reference data set, maybe there's no buses there at this time or something like that. But we still did miss those 39, and about 7.7% rate, at least for the sample. So that's what we think our omission rate is approximately. So why did we miss some? Because we hope we wouldn't miss any, obviously, but there's always some error involved, and the error tended to come from a confusion between the background parking lot and the surface material and the bus itself. So if the bus was very white and the background material was very white, they bleed into each other, and it wasn't easy to find the edges of those buses as one object. Also, sometimes buses were under trees or in shaded areas, and we weren't able to visually find them with the imagery through an automatic process. And sometimes the buses were so closely clustered together that they look like one big object. And again, remember, part of our method was to find objects about the size of a bus. But if they're right next to each other, it looks like one object. We're not able to tell those apart and find that correct shape. And of course, depots inside buildings are not detectable by this method, but we don't know how many of those there were. We had a school transportation expert initially estimate how many depots there are likely to be in the U.S. It was just really an estimate by kind of an expert, but we don't know how accurate it was, but the estimate was 13,000 in the lower 48. We detected 11,300 buses, and if you factor in our omission error, it actually gets quite close to about 13,000 depots. So it was one additional way to validate our general findings. So we're pretty happy with those results, but happy to talk about them. I think Leah is going to continue with a little bit more information on the results. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I will share some takeaways from the geographic distribution of the depots we found. This unfortunately does not include analysis related to electricity demand modeling or equity. I'm still very keen to do those, but I will get to that later. One major limitation I wanted to point out is that this data set consists of a point that we know is somewhere in the depot. It does not include the number of buses, but counting the buses at some point in the future would enable a much more nuanced analysis of things like the amount of air pollution and the amount of electricity demand. So here is the map. All of these graphics are taken from the technical note. I'll include the link to the data set in the technical note at the end. But here, yeah, is the distribution of the 11,309 depots that we found. As you can see, they're not evenly distributed. They're mostly concentrated in the eastern half of the country and the West Coast and some of the major population centers in between. One of the major findings is that a lot of school buses are kept at schools. That was a big surprise for a whole team and not something that I think anyone was aware of at a national scale. We'd heard anecdotally that sometimes they keep the buses at the school, but these charts on the right show the number of depots at a given distance from a school on the y-axis and the distance to the nearest school on the x-axis using a school location JS data set from NCES. So you can see that there's a huge concentration of depots close to schools, peaking around 250 meters or so, and then dropping off very steeply around 500 meters or so. So this is important because it means that the air pollution emissions would be concentrated even closer to where there are many children. But it also points to some potential synergies. For example, charging school buses from solar panels on or near schools, which is a growing practice, or something like providing vehicle-to-grid services, which could allow school bus batteries to power schools during emergencies and make them shelters, things like that. So let's look now at some state level analysis. The main things here, I think, are heterogeneity and more questions. But this map shows the number of school bus depots in each state, ranges from 4 to 841. And that high end is over here in North Carolina. My theory is that this has to do partly with things like the prevalence of school transportation. Just school buses are not as common in some states, more rural states. It might also have something to do with the size and number of school districts, which also varies a lot between states, and also the prevalence of private fleet operators, because the buses can be owned or operated by either the public school district or by a private company that the school district contracts with. So some more state level analysis. This is looking at the number of residents per school bus depot. So it's sort of depots per capita. There's also a huge range of 14 times variation, with the most residents per school bus depot in California and Florida. California is not a big surprise because it's a very populous state with actually relatively little school transportation. Not that many students ride the bus, but again, there's a lot of range. And we also saw that in the number of school bus riders per depot. So the previous one was total population per depot. This is children who ride the school bus. That data was available from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. And interestingly, that looks very different as well. Yeah, a lot of heterogeneity in questions, but it ranges anywhere from 300 to about 4,000 school bus riders per depot, about 9 times variation. So then looking ahead, one of the near-term uses for this data set is going to be feeding into this e-roadmap from EPRI, which is modeling future electricity demand from specifically medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification. This data set is not yet incorporated, I think probably to do with the issue of bus counting, as I mentioned, but that's a near term use. And then I'm still very keen to analyze the health equity impacts of the air pollution from school bus depot siting. It's not quite underway yet, but it's a pet project of mine. So if you want to collaborate or know of someone who does, please feel free to reach out. And then I've been looking quickly at the chat, but just to clarify, this data set is public, free, publicly available, hashtag open data. You can find it at this link, or if you just search for data set of US school bus depots, it should come up with a lot more detail about the methods as well. And you can contact us at the addresses here.
Thank you so much for presenting this research and showing us how to do it and providing us the resources with the public data set. There was a comment by Jeff Myers in the chat here about repeating it for other sorts of snapshots. Reading it now.
Yeah, so that was one of the reasons we went with NAPE. That data set is intended actually for agricultural related analyses. So it's taken during the growing season, which overlaps very heavily with the summer, which is when school buses are in use the least. So we thought that would be when it was likely that the most buses would be at their depot, and then it would be easier to identify the depots because many would be parked. But I didn't read to the end of your comment. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm
maybe
reading
Gregory
this,
wants to
I'll
chime
add a
in.
little bit, yeah. Basically, first of all, we did look at two different time frames when it was useful. We used two different imagery. One was NAPE, one was on Google Earth, and I don't recall where that imagery came from, but I think it's a mix of different air photo imagery from different sources. But we did look at two images when it was useful. If we weren't sure if it wasn't a depot or not, and that was done during the phase of the analyst oversight. But it's not easy to find a ton of these images, right? Because like the NAPE imagery is only done every 3 years, and if you look more than 3 years back, of course, depots can come and go. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah,
Let
but
me know
in
if
essence,
not.
I agree that would have been better, but at some point we have some capacity constraints.
Yeah, it does take a lot.
And then the question from Jen about it's sort of asking about data sources in essence, I think. Go back. Yeah, so that was one of our first thoughts was to ask public agencies. The first thought was actually state departments of education or transportation because we had also done a large data collection exercise related to the school bus fleets, so the number of vehicles, the make, model, fuel type, so on at the state level, and states did tend to have that data, but we reached out to many and none seemed to have locations of school bus depots. I think possibly in part because a lot of them are privately owned and operated by these private school transportation operated companies. School districts themselves do need to respond to public inquiries. In theory, it would have been possible to ask all 13,000 plus, but again, there are some capacity constraints. And then also, as mentioned, a large share of these buses are privately owned, and those operators don't need to respond. I think it's probably up to like 40% of school buses are privately owned. So that would have been less complete, I think.
I'll add one more thing, that is that the school bus counting actually was led by Young Showerth, our first author of this paper, and he is actually finished, and we're planning to update the tech note soon. Yes, I'm not quite sure how we'll summarize that data, but that's coming. Just to note though, that was a counting of how many school buses were in those depots at the moment that the photograph was taken. If that was during the day, and most of this was in the summer, but sometimes school buses are deployed in the summertime, and we don't know how that correlates to the amount of buses actually in the depot that stay there regularly. But we will update that information pretty soon.
Thank you so much. I'll review some of the sessions that are coming up next. And the next one, active transportation and transit, travel demand and transportation choices, and finally, transportation planning and policy. The links and to the Zoom rooms as well as the program are posted in the chat. If there are any other questions? Oh, we do have some questions coming in from Roy as well. Why is the map showing New York City area? Just a screenshot of limited data. If there are any other questions for the current speakers or those that presented before, please put them in the chat. We'll keep the Zoom room open for a couple more minutes. Again, thank you again for all the presenters and the audience for coming and attending and asking all these questions.
Yeah. Oh, there's another question on correlation between depots and student population. Not really. I think because there is not necessarily a correlation between the number of students and the number of school bus riders, of students riding the bus. School bus riding is much more common in suburban, urban areas and smaller towns, not really in rural areas. So at least at the state level, where there's a mix of locale types, there wasn't much of a correlation. I think there's a higher correlation between the number of depots and the number of schools, maybe. I can double check the data. But that's a great question.
First, at least the first question, how does NAEP data handle tree cover? So NAEP data is actually just simply photographs taken from airplanes. And if there's a tree in it, the tree is shown. And if there's a school bus under the tree, at least the part that's under the tree is not seen, which is where some of our error occurred, or in shadows. So I hope that answers your question, but let me know if you want more info. Did you do any cross-checking with each state's youth population? That's the Florida children to depot ratio seems strange.
Should I take to that or?
Please, yeah.
Yeah. We didn't do youth population specifically. That's a good idea. We just did total population and school bus riders. Yeah, I think a lot of this seems strange because of the differences in operational models of school transportation between states. So what I would guess is going on in Florida is there's a smaller number of depots and they're all larger. So it's not necessarily that there's more or less school buses per student, but just that the buses are more concentrated in fewer depots, which would give you a much higher ratio of students to depot, which might have to do with things like the extent to which school transportation is privately operated. The private operators tend to have fewer larger depots as opposed to the school districts that have fewer smaller depots or keep them at schools. It might also have something to do with land availability or land prices, how easy it is to get a large parking lot in a place you want it near a school. But yeah, as I said, the main theme in the state analysis is heterogeneity and more questions. Please use this data set to try to answer them. Matt, no, we didn't do anything like that, but that's exactly the kind of thing I would hope people would do with this public data set. Go for it, Matt.